When I was a kid growing up in my parents' house, I did not eat cake for breakfast because I didn't break the rules. I was a good kid. The truth was, no one got punished in my parents' house. No one ever got put on restrictions or anything like that. All we had to do was endure my mother's histrionics, and that was punishment enough. She could faint on demand. Imagine how that would make you feel as a kid. But when I was barely a teenager, I fell in love with an older man. Ooh, he was handsome. He was sexy. My heart would go thumpity thump every time he galloped across my black and white TV set. He was the Marlboro Man. And in my heart's fantasy, one day he was going to come by. He was going to scoop me up. I would straddle his horse behind him with my arms around his muscular middle. We would ride off across the prairie, and then we would smoke our Marlboro cigarettes and watch the sun set. So, of course, I thought the least I could do to nurture this fantasy was to learn to smoke cigarettes. So, which was forbidden in my house. So I bought a box of cigarettes, Marlboros, put them in my purse. And I lived in the heart of Brooklyn, so it was really easy to find places to smoke. You know, lots of building tops and vacant lots and alleys with dumpsters and things like that. And then one night, I was up in my bed doing homework, and everybody in the house had fallen asleep. And I thought, I could smoke a cigarette. Nobody will know. So I fished one out from my purse, and I lit up. And I was on my second drag when I heard footsteps coming down the hall. I took that cigarette and I snuffed it out into this little makeshift aluminum foil ashtray, shoved it under the blanket just as my door pushed open and my father came in. I smell smoke. Are you smoking cigarettes in here? Cigarettes? Me? Oh, I smell that, Dad. Must be coming in through the open window. I bet somebody walked down the street smoking a cigarette. And he just glared at me and walked out of my room and shut the door. When I thought it was safe, I pulled back the blanket. On the way to extinguishing itself, that cigarette had rolled off that little ashtray and burnt a perfect little hole in the sheet. And I knew my mother was going to see that. I tried to disguise it with some crayons and a pen, and I finally gave up and I went to sleep. The next day after school, I was at my friend's house when the telephone rang. Madeline, it's for you. Hello? And in a voice so cold, icicles grew on every word, I heard my father say, "Come home right now." Every step of that walk home sounded like the toll of a death knell. I reached my house, I opened the door, I walked in, there were my parents. And my father had gone into my purse, he had found my package of Marlboros, and he was holding them. And my mother was holding my sheet with that cigarette hole perfectly centered between her fingers. And it began. My mother yelled at me. My mother screamed at me. Oh, it was so terrible. It was the best performance she ever gave. She got red in her chest and then up her neck, and then her face got red, and little veins started pulsating in her temples, and spittle gathered in the corners of her mouth. I mean, it was so alarming. My father got scared. He looked over to her and he said so gently, he said, "Darling, settle down." There was a morph in the atmosphere. a redirection of my mother's anger. She turned on my father. You're telling me to settle down? You're telling me to settle down? You're telling me to settle down? And the argument had taken a whole new turn, none of which was directed at me. And I stood there thinking about this and realizing this is no longer about me. So I took a little step backwards. They didn't notice. I took another little step backwards. They still didn't notice. So I hightailed it up the stairs and into my room, and I shut the door. The battle raged on downstairs with my mother yelling and screaming, and my father trying to placate her. But darling, but honey, but darling. And then I heard it. The choke, the gurgle, the cough, the plop on the floor. Mom was down for the count. And I had survived. But I learned a couple of things. Well, for one thing, I learned that real boys were a lot more interesting than TV actors in commercials. And I also learned that my smoking career was destined to be short-lived. And I learned that there was no such thing as privacy, even in the purse that my mother had guaranteed to be private when she gave it to me. And I also learned that sometimes you can never tell how things are going to work out. Thank you.